Just a temp nurse. That's what the staffing agency called her when Sacred Heart's ICU requested coverage for the overnight shift rotation. Rachel Torres didn't correct them. She never corrected anything anymore. The paperwork said her name was Margaret Chen, 5 years of med-surg experience at a hospital in Charlotte that no longer existed, not in any official database, anyway. The employment history was clean. The references were untraceable. The woman who had held the line in Sangin for 9 hours with nothing but combat gauze and a sidearm had been thoroughly erased, filed under a different name, handed discharge papers that ordered her to disappear forever. She had complied. She was still complying. The fluorescent lights of Sacred Heart's ICU hummed their particular frequency of cruelty, a sound that never quite stabilized, never quite stopped. Rachel moved through the unit in scrubs 2 sizes too large, the fabric hanging loose enough to hide the framework beneath, the muscle memory that made her lethal. Shoulders square. Eyes forward. One measured breath per insult that hadn't come yet but would. She had learned long ago that invisibility was a weapon sharpened by silence and compliance and the kind of composure that came from surviving things that killed other people. Her badge clattered against the laminate counter as she logged into the computer at 23:22. The sound was sharp enough to make the resident look up from his tablet. He didn't recognize her. Nobody recognized her. That was the entire point. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs as she leaned forward, the only physical proof of who she was, the only thing she couldn't bring herself to destroy. Some nights, alone in the locker room, she pressed her palm against it just to confirm the fabric was still there. Room 12 held the dying Navy captain. His name was Marcus Webb. He had been brought in 4 days ago with a catastrophic cardiac event, the kind that made surgeons shake their heads and use words like irreversible and comfort care. His daughter sat rigid in the chair beside the bed, her phone clutched in both hands, the way people held things when they were drowning and grabbing for anything solid. Rachel had seen that posture 1,000 times. She would see it 1,000 times more. She approached the bed with the 4 bag and the tubing coiled in her left hand, her movements economical and practiced. The central line needed checking. The dressing was showing signs of compromise, a small amount of seepage around the hub, nothing critical yet but heading toward infection if ignored. She unwound fresh gauze from the supply cart, her fingers moving with the kind of precision that came from closing chest wounds in the field while rounds snapped overhead and the woman beside you was screaming into the radio for medevac that wouldn't arrive for 40 minutes. The captain's eyes were clouded, heavy with sedation. The ventilator breathed for him in mechanical intervals, a rhythm that sounded like surrender. Rachel changed the fur dressing with the kind of care she gave to everyone, the kind that said, "You matter," even if the system is already writing your obituary, even if the doctors have already decided you're a resource allocation problem. Her hands didn't shake. They never shook anymore. The trembling, that particular nervous system response that normal people had been trained out of her or burned out of her or simply never developed in the first place. She didn't remember which. The captain's daughter watched every movement. Is he getting worse?" she asked. Her voice had the fractured quality of someone who had been crying for 4 days straight. "His numbers are stable," Rachel said. The words were truthful and meaningless, which made them the perfect thing to say. "I'm just replacing the dressing to prevent infection." The daughter nodded. She wanted to believe that infection prevention mattered, that the small careful acts of basic nursing care meant survival was still possible. Rachel understood that impulse. She let the woman believe it for another 30 seconds while she secured the gauze and stepped back. The 3-finger scar pattern across her left knuckles went unnoticed. The pattern was distinctive if anyone knew how to read it, the mark of field sutures closed in darkness with nothing but tactical flashlight and a needle meant for stitching tent canvas. One scar was from a bullet fragment that had grazed her during the 4th hour of holding the perimeter. Another was from a knife wound that had caught her during close quarters when ammunition ran dry. The third was from shrapnel that had been embedded in a young Marine's arm, and she had dug it out herself using surgical tweezers and her own blood for lubrication because there was no sterile field and no time for sterile procedure. Just survival. She was restocking the 4 supplies when Dr. Sterling entered room 12. He was tall in the way that men who had never been hungry were tall, well-nourished, well-rested, carrying himself with the particular confidence of someone who had never had to question whether he belonged. His white coat was pristine. His stethoscope hung from his neck like a symbol of authority rather than a tool for listening. He glanced at Rachel for approximately 2 seconds, his eyes tracking her with the disinterested assessment someone might give to a piece of equipment that was functioning adequately. "You're the agency temp?" he asked. Rachel nodded once. She didn't look away from the 4 pump she was adjusting. "We'll see how long that lasts," Sterling said. It wasn't a statement of fact. It was a warning delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had absolute institutional power and knew exactly how to deploy it. He moved to the bedside and began his examination. His movements were brisk, clinical, efficient. He didn't touch the captain's hand. He didn't look at the daughter. He checked the cardiac monitor with the expression of someone reading a menu at a restaurant he'd already decided to leave. "His ejection fraction is essentially 0, Sterling said. He was speaking to himself more than anyone else, that particular doctor voice that treated patients as problems to be solved or, more frequently, abandoned. "We're doing him no favors keeping him on the vent." The daughter made a small sound, something between a question and a plea. Rachel didn't look directly at her, but she saw the motion, the way the woman's hand gripped the phone tighter, the way her shoulders collapsed inward. "I'd recommend we transition to comfort care," Sterling continued. "Let nature take its course. The suffering ends faster that way." "How much faster?" the daughter asked. Her voice was barely functional, fractured the way voices become when the owner has been drowning for days. "Hours. Maybe a full day if his body's stubborn," Sterling said. He was already moving toward the monitor, dismissing the question as though it had already been answered. "I'll write the order." Rachel's hand stilled. Just for a moment. Just long enough for the gesture to register as something other than continued mechanical movement. She didn't look at the daughter. She didn't look at Sterling. She finished checking the 4-line, secured the final connection with a small click of plastic, and stepped back. The daughter was weeping now, the kind of quiet broken weeping that happens when people have already cried so much that the body no longer has the energy for drama. Just the steady dripping of tears and the silence of complete devastation. Rachel moved closer, not too close, nothing that would draw attention or trigger a complaint about inappropriate bedside manner. She stood beside the chair for exactly 3 seconds. Her hand rested on the daughter's shoulder, the touch light enough that it could almost be accidental, could almost be written off as the natural movement of someone passing through the space. The contact lasted long enough for Rachel to feel the trembling beneath the fabric of the woman's jacket, and then she withdrew and moved to the next room. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what walked through the ICU doors at 6:15 that morning. Jake Morrison arrived in dress blues, the uniform of a Marine with the bearing of someone who had seen things that changed how you stood in space. His name was written on the roster Rachel checked before her shift ended. He was rotating through the ICU for observation, a corpsman on leave gathering additional training before his next deployment. He was there to learn how to keep people alive in controlled environments, the clinical opposite of the field medicine he practiced on deployment. He moved through the unit with a particular kind of respect, the way someone moved who understood that hospitals and combat zones were separated only by funding and time. Rachel was pulling vital signs from the captain's monitor when Jake approached the bed. He stopped when he saw his father. The kind of stop that was about more than just his feet ceasing to move. The kind of stop that involved his entire nervous system recognizing something irreversible. She didn't look up from the screen. Professional composure. Agency temp who wouldn't be there long enough to become memorable. She adjusted the alarm parameters on the cardiac monitor, something that needed doing anyway, a legitimate clinical task that provided cover for her hand's continued presence in the vicinity of the bed. Jake's eyes tracked her movements for the briefest moment. Just long enough for Rachel to feel the weight of his attention, the way trained observers noticed things. Then he looked at his father, and everything else became secondary. The night shift supervisor was calling out assignments. Rachel gathered the empty 4 bags and the used gauze from the supply cart, moving toward the trash receptacle with a kind of efficiency that invited no questions. The unit was beginning its shift change, the particular chaos of reports and handoffs and 12 people trying to move through the same narrow corridors. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't quite an order yet. It was the first moment of a much larger sequence, the moment when forces begin to move that will eventually bring everything to the surface. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining seemed to press harder against her ribs, as though it was trying to remind her of things she had spent 18 months learning to forget. Rachel Torres, or whoever she was supposed to be today, finished her final rounds and clocked out at 7:30. She walked through the parking lot in scrub still damp with the night shift, her badge already removed and tucked into the locker where it would remain until the next rotation. The rain had stopped sometime in the hours before dawn, leaving the asphalt dark and reflecting the streetlights like a mirror of sky turned downward. She didn't think about the captain. She didn't think about the daughter. She certainly didn't think about Dr. Sterling, or the way he had already begun constructing the narrative that would justify the withdrawal order. Thinking about these things was a luxury that people with normal nervous systems could afford. Rachel had learned to move through the world in the spaces between thought and action, the places where muscle memory and training provided sufficient direction without requiring consciousness to participate. The unit patch remained hidden against her ribs. The false name remained untouched. The woman who had held the line in Sangin for 9 hours remained thoroughly erased. For now. The moment Rachel Torres questioned Dr. Sterling's decision to withdraw life support from the Navy captain in room 12, she became his project. Not his patient. His project. The kind that required systematic dismantling. It started small. During morning rounds on the 3rd day, Sterling stopped at the captain's bedside while the man's daughter sat rigid in the vinyl chair, eyes swollen from crying. Rachel stood near the monitor, checking the settings on the 4-pump, a routine task, invisible work. Sterling's voice carried the precision of a scalpel. Miss Torres here believes her 6 weeks of agency training supersedes my 15 years of critical care experience. Tell me, Torres, where exactly did you get your medical degree? A correspondence course. The daughter's face crumpled further. Her hands trembled in her lap. Rachel took one measured breath through her nose, the kind that once kept her steady in Sangin while rounds snapped past her ears. I'm asking if we've exhausted all options, Doctor. Her voice came out level. Composed. The way you speak when you've learned that breaking gives the enemy information. Sterling smiled. It was the smile of someone who believed he was untouchable. Your questionable employment history suggests you're not qualified to ask anything. He turned to leave, and as he passed the monitor, he let his eyes linger on Rachel's hands, steady hands, calloused hands, hands that didn't shake, as if daring them to betray her. By 0900, the unit board bore witness to his next move. Written in Sterling's precise script, laminated with aggressive permanence, Torres, unauthorized patient contact, insubordination, the 15th of March, 23. Rachel stood in front of it for 3 seconds, reading her own public execution. 2 nurses rounded the corner, saw her there, and pivoted hard left without speaking. The message was clear. Sterling had weaponized hospital policy the way special operations units weaponized intelligence, surgically, deliberately, with maximum psychological impact. The break room became her exile. For 3 straight days, Rachel entered through the double doors at 1,400 hours during her 15-minute break, poured coffee that tasted like burnt rubber and regret, and watched the space empty within seconds. Not gradually. Not with politeness. The speed was calculated. Deliberately hostile. A pregnant nurse who'd smiled at her yesterday suddenly needed to check her phone. An older tech who'd asked about her background muttered something about urgent supplies and fled. The silence that followed was the kind that comes from coordinated cruelty, the kind that said Sterling had been talking, had been planting seeds, had been making it clear what happened to nurses who questioned him. They whispered when she passed in hallways. Agency Annie. Not to her face. Always 3 steps behind. Always in clusters where they thought she couldn't hear but could smell the contempt like ozone after a defibrillator discharge. Rachel kept moving. Kept her shoulders square. Kept her face the careful blank of someone who'd learned long ago that showing pain was a liability. The worst part came on day 4 when Sterling delivered her formal performance review not in a private office, not in HR, but in room 12 while the captain's oxygen saturation tanked to 87%. Sterling's voice filled the small space between the medical equipment and the man's failing body like a toxin, like something airborne that couldn't be contained. You lack the educational foundation for critical care. Frankly, I question whether you belong in medicine at all. Rachel felt the words like shrapnel, not sharp enough to make her bleed outward, sharp enough to wound everything beneath the surface. One tear traced her cheek unbidden. A single betrayal of her own discipline. She didn't blink. She didn't step back. She didn't let her jaw clench or her shoulders curve inward. Instead, she wiped it away without breaking eye contact and spoke the only words that mattered. "I've closed more chest wounds than you've seen, doctor." The room went dead silent. The captain's monitor beeped its mechanical rhythm. The ventilator wheezed like something drowning. Sterling's face darkened, and in that moment, something shifted in the space between them. The minute a predator realizes it's miscalculated, that it's just shown its throat to something far more dangerous than it understood. But Rachel was already turning back to the monitor, already dismissing him the way commanders dismiss junior officers, and it was that dismissal that made Sterling's hands clench at his sides. That's when Jake Morrison appeared in the doorway. The captain's son. The Marine corpsman rotating through Sacred Heart on a 2-week leave from Camp Lejeune, here to watch his father die, here to witness his final collapse. He'd frozen mid-step, his eyes locked on Rachel's hands as they moved across the captain's chest, not trembling, not hesitant, moving with the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from textbooks. His pupils dilated the way they do when someone's seeing something impossible in plain sight. She was repositioning the chest tube with 3-finger pressure technique, the adaptation they taught in field medicine when you're kneeling in sand and dust with rounds incoming and no surgical team within 50 kilometers. Rachel felt his gaze like thermal imaging. Felt him recognizing something in her hands that he'd only seen in classified briefings and operational debriefs. She didn't acknowledge it. She finished her work, checked the oxygen saturation, 90% and climbing, and moved toward the monitor without making eye contact with Sterling, without making eye contact with Jake, without making eye contact with anyone who might see what was written in her muscle memory. But Jake Morrison didn't forget what he'd seen. He didn't forget the precision. He didn't forget the technique. At 1800 hours, he found her in the hallway outside room 12, his uniform crisp with the kind of discipline that only comes from 13 years of military service. His voice was quiet, the voice of someone trained to extract information without intimidation, that 3-finger technique you used repositioning his chest tube. Where'd you learn that? Rachel's face went carefully blank, a practiced disappearance, the same blank she'd worn during interrogations, during debriefs, during every moment she'd learned to be invisible. Standard nursing procedure, petty officer. She used his rank deliberately. A small assertion. A reference to the uniform he wore. No, Jake said quietly, and his voice carried the weight of someone who'd served in places that don't exist on maps. That's field decompression adaptation. I've only seen it twice. Both times in Helm and Province. Both times from Special Operations medics. Rachel's hands went still at her sides. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only physical proof of who she'd been, felt suddenly heavier against her ribs, like it was broadcasting its existence, like invisible signals were radiating from the stitching. "You're mistaken, petty officer," she said, and she turned away. But turning away from someone trained to read human behavior under fire was like trying to disappear when you're the only heat signature on thermal imaging. Jake didn't let it go. Over the next 72 hours, he started watching her during every shift, noting how she moved with the economical grace of someone who'd learned efficiency in environments where wasted motion meant casualties. He watched her anticipate hemorrhage before the monitors registered the drop. He watched her position trauma supplies in room 12 not by the protocol manual but by the patterns of someone who'd done it 100 times under fire, who'd learned to predict what you'd need 3 moves before the crisis arrived. He was piecing together a puzzle, and every piece of the puzzle was screaming military operator. At 2,300 hours on the 4th night after Sterling's public humiliation, the captain's vitals began deteriorating in the way that terminal decline becomes something different, something acute. Heart rate climbing from 92 to 118 to 134. Blood pressure dropping from 138/82 to 104/58 to 89/44. Rachel checked the monitor and her entire body shifted into the calm of someone who'd seen catastrophic hemorrhage and knew exactly what it looked like. She paged the on-call resident twice. Nothing. She called again, and this time the resident answered with the sound of someone being roused from sleep. Torres, his already DNR track. "Why are you making noise?" Rachel pointed to the monitor even though he couldn't see her gesture. "His pressure's dropping and heart sounds are muffled. He needs an echo." The resident's voice came back coated in dismissal. "Dr. Sterling's orders are clear. Comfort care only." Rachel hung up the phone and stood in the darkness of room 12, listening to the captain's labored breathing, feeling the weight of every protocol that demanded she do nothing while a man died of something reversible. And that's when Jake found her at the bedside, his corpsman training already reading the vital signs, already understanding what was happening, already seeing his father die of something that could be fixed. "We need to call someone," he said quietly. "No one will answer," Rachel replied. But Jake Morrison was about to learn what happened when you questioned whether Rachel Torres would simply accept defeat. Jake Morrison was waiting outside room 12 when Rachel emerged from the supply closet at 1800 hours, his Marine Corps dress uniform still crisp from the morning visit, his eyes carrying something sharper than a son's concern. He stepped into her path with the kind of deliberate placement that came from training, not aggressive, just impossible to move around without acknowledgement. "That technique," he said quietly. "The 3-finger repositioning on the chest tube. Where did you learn that?" Rachel kept walking. Her pace didn't change. "Procedural video. YouTube." "No." Jake matched her stride, his voice dropping lower. "That's not a standard nursing technique. That's not in any textbook. I watched you place your fingers exactly 18 millimeters apart, apply pressure in a 3-point contact pattern, and reposition without dislodging the line. That's field medicine. That's combat zone medicine." She turned a corner toward the medication dispensary, her expression locked in professional neutrality. "Interesting observation, petty officer. Gunnery sergeant, actually." He was closer now, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I know what I saw. My unit ran the exact same procedure in Helmand. We called it the Sangin press because that's where we learned it. 2-fingered wasn't deep enough for blood clots. 3 fingers gets the visceral clot without rupturing the membrane. Only 16 people in the entire 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines were cleared to perform it." Rachel stopped at the medication dispensary. She entered her credentials, the screen glowing pale in the fluorescent hallway light. She did not turn around. "I've never been to Sangin." "Then how?" "Procedural training. The hospital offers continuing education." Her voice was level, conversational, utterly devoid of texture. "I attended a seminar on advanced chest tube management last year. The instructor was a retired trauma surgeon who worked military contracts. He taught the technique as an alternative method for complicated clots." Jake's breath came out slowly, the kind of exhale that meant he didn't believe her but understood he wouldn't get confirmation. His eyes were the color of wet slate, intelligent and searching. "Right. Continuing education." Rachel typed in her password. The medication drawer slid open with a soft mechanical hiss. Because if someone had actually been in Sangin, Jake continued, his voice carrying the weight of a corpsman who'd held dying Marines, they'd understand why that technique matters. Why the precision matters. Why hands that can do that under pressure. He paused. He was staring at her hands now, the way they moved with absolute steadiness as she withdrew a bottle of metoprolol. Those hands have done something. Rachel closed the drawer. She faced him directly for the first time, and something in her eyes, just for a fraction of a second, acknowledged that he had recognized something true. But her voice remained clinical. Your father's condition is deteriorating. His oxygen saturation dropped to 88% during my last assessment. His blood pressure is trending downward. The hemodynamic changes suggest possible fluid accumulation around the heart. Jake's jaw tightened. He understood the subject change. He understood it meant the conversation was over. He's already DNR tracked. Sterling made that clear. Yes, Rachel said simply. He did. She moved past Jake into the hallway, and he didn't follow. She could feel his eyes on her back, could sense the moment recognition crystallized into something harder, not accusation, but awareness. The awareness that he'd encountered something authentic beneath the temp nurse uniform, something that didn't exist in any personnel file. But she was already moving toward the ICU corridor, her pace unchanged, her composure intact. The doubt in Jake Morrison's eyes was a problem for later. Right now, the captain's monitors were telling a different story. The evening shift brought a deterioration that no amount of clinical detachment could obscure. By 1900 hours, Rachel noticed the subtle signs that everyone else missed because they weren't looking. The captain's neck veins were slightly more distended than this morning. His breathing had shifted, less effort, less air movement, the kind of shallow pattern that came when the lungs had nowhere to expand. The blood pressure crept downward, 118 to 115 to 112. Small movements, each one explainable on its own. Together, they told a story of increasing pressure inside the chest cavity. She checked the chest tube output. 50 milliliters since this morning. Normal drainage would be maybe 10. The blood wasn't flowing out anymore because the space around the heart was getting crowded, compressing the tube, slowing the drainage. Passive accumulation, turning into an active problem. Rachel said nothing to the on-call resident, Dr. Patterson, a man in his late 20s with trembling hands and a habit of checking his phone between patient assessments. She said nothing to the nursing supervisor because Sterling's written warnings were still fresh in the break room, and she'd learned the cost of looking like she was overstepping. She documented her observations in the chart and waited. By 2000 hours, the waiting ended. The captain's blood pressure was 98/62. His oxygen saturation had dropped to 89 despite supplemental oxygen climbing to 40%. His heart rate had accelerated to 118, the body's desperate attempt to maintain perfusion as the cardiac output dropped. The monitors created a symphony of worry, the ventilator's soft rhythmic wheeze, the cardiac monitor's accelerating beat pattern, the blood pressure cuff cycling every 15 minutes with readings that meant time was becoming a finite resource. Rachel recognized the cascade. Cardiac tamponade didn't announce itself with fanfare. It whispered first, then it screamed, and by the time it screamed, a patient was usually 4 minutes from cardiac arrest. The captain's eyes opened. They were lucid, aware. He'd been sedated for 3 days, but something in his condition, some primitive animal instinct, had pulled him toward consciousness. His fingers moved on the bedside rail. He was trying to speak, trying to tell someone that something was wrong inside his chest. Rachel pressed the code button at 20:43 hours. Dr. Patterson arrived at 20:45 hours, his movements carrying the panicked energy of a resident who understood he was over his head. His eyes went immediately to the monitor. The blood pressure was now 94/58. What happened? He was stable this morning. Cardiac tamponade, Rachel said. The words were delivered with absolute calm, the kind of tone that belongs in operating rooms, not ICU hallways. Pericardial sac is filling with blood. The right atrium is being compressed. Blood pressure is cascading. We have approximately 4 minutes before arrest. Dr. Patterson's hand moved toward his phone. I need to call Dr. Sterling. The patient is DNR tracked. We can't. We don't have 4 minutes to wait for Dr. Sterling's authorization. Rachel was already moving, her hands pulling the crash cart closer with a smooth precision that made the gesture look inevitable rather than urgent. We have 4 minutes to prevent this patient from dying. I can't authorize intervention on a DNR patient, Dr. Patterson said, and there was genuine anguish in his voice. He understood that he was trapped between protocol and ethics, between following rules and watching a man die. Sterling was explicit. No heroics. No. Rachel opened the crash cart drawer. The pericardiocentesis kit lay inside, the components organized with the same methodical precision as ammunition in a field aid bag. Needle. Syringe. Catheter. Tubing. Then you stand there and document that I acted without your authorization. She didn't wait for a response. She moved to the bedside, her hands moving with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than textbooks, somewhere that lived in muscle memory and survival instinct. The captain's upper abdomen was already exposed. She located the anatomical landmarks, the xiphoid process, the angle where the ribs met the sternum, the invisible door to the pericardial sac that lay just beneath the skin. The room was quiet except for the monitors. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical song. Somewhere in the hallway, Jake Morrison had heard the code call and was moving toward the room, his marine training pulling him toward crisis. Rachel prepped the subxiphoid area with 3 efficient swipes of antiseptic. The smell of iodine filled the space, sharp, clinical, grounding. She positioned the needle. Her hands were steady as surgical lasers, the kind of steady that comes from having done this before, from having done it when the consequences of error were measured in lives rather than lawsuits. 80/40, she called out. Advancing 5 millimeters. Watch for electrical change. She advanced the needle through skin, through fascia, through the thin membrane that separated the outside world from the space around the heart. There was resistance, then release, the needle piercing into the pericardial sac. She aspirated gently, drawing back on the syringe, and fluid rushed in. Not clear fluid. Blood. 200 milliliters. Maybe more. The syringe filled with dark red, thick with the weight of gravity and desperation. With each milliliter withdrawn, the pressure decreased. The physical compression on the right atrium eased. The heart could expand again. Blood pressure is climbing, Dr. Patterson whispered. 95/60. 100/65. 110/70. The captain's color changed. The bluish tint at his lips faded. His oxygen saturation climbed from 89 to 92 to 95. The monitor's panicked beeping slowed into a rhythm that spoke of survival rather than crisis. Rachel finished withdrawing the blood, secured the catheter in place with a single piece of tape, and stepped back from the bedside. The whole procedure had taken 11 minutes. It should have taken 20. Dr. Patterson was staring at her the way someone stares at an event they don't have a framework for understanding. How did you? He didn't finish. His eyes moved to the captain, who was breathing easier, whose blood pressure was now a respectable 112/72, whose color suggested that he might actually survive the next hour. Rachel was already cleaning her hands at the sink, the antiseptic foam pink against her skin. Document it as emergency intervention for acute cardiac decompensation. The patient's DNR status was overridden due to life-threatening emergency and lack of attending physician presence. Dr. Sterling will have 17 minutes to arrive before his phone starts ringing with increasingly difficult questions, Rachel finished. Her voice had shifted something, not quite commanding, not quite deferential. It carried the weight of someone who had made a choice and accepted the consequences. Until then, the patient is stable. That's what the monitors will show. She dried her hands and locked the room door behind her as she left. Dr. Patterson remained at the bedside, his eyes still on the monitors, still processing the fact that a temp nurse had just performed a procedure that should have required an attending cardiologist, an ultrasound machine, and a sterile operating room. The hallway was empty except for Jake Morrison, who stood frozen 8 feet from the doorway. His eyes had widened. His hands had clenched into fists. He'd watched through the window, watched the positioning, the precision, the absolute authority with which Rachel had moved through a crisis that should have broken her. He had seen the 3-finger technique deployed in real time, on a real patient, with a kind of speed and accuracy that belonged to someone who had done it before. Who had done it in a place where mistakes meant body bags. Rachel locked eyes with him for just a moment. Not long enough for conversation. Long enough for acknowledgement. Then she was walking toward the medication dispensary, her pace steady, her composure intact, leaving Jake Morrison standing in the hallway with recognition crystallizing into certainty, but no proof, no confirmation, and no way to ask the questions his corpsman's training was screaming at him. What happened next didn't just silence the room. It was about to end careers. The monitors screamed at 0200 hours. Blood pressure 70/40 and plummeting. O2 sat dropping from 88 to 82 to 76. The captain's lips had gone the color of wet concrete. His chest heaved against the ventilator, fighting the machine that was supposed to save him, and Rachel knew exactly what was happening before the resident did, knew it the way a body remembers what it learned in sand and blood and screaming radio static. Cardiac tamponade. Blood pooling in the pericardial sac, crushing the heart like a fist closing around a bird. The on-call resident, a kid named Patterson, maybe 28, eyes already wide, reached for the phone. His hands trembled as he called the code. Code blue, ICU bed 12. Pressure's bottoming out, SAT's critical. His voice cracked on the last word. Rachel was already moving. She didn't wait for permission. Didn't wait for Sterling. Didn't breathe. Just crossed the room in 4 strides, her movements precise as a sniper's trigger finger, and locked the patient room door behind her. The click was soft. Final. This room was a vault now, and nothing was getting in that she didn't let in. Patterson stared at her. What are you? Get me a 14-gauge needle. Her voice didn't sound like the voice that had apologized to Dr. Sterling 6 hours earlier. This voice was steel drawn across stone. 7mm syringe. Antiseptic. Local anesthetic. Now. She didn't say please. She didn't ask. It wasn't a request. It was a command, and Patterson moved like his body understood something his brain hadn't caught up to yet. The kind of authority that made people stop questioning and start obeying. The kind that came from having given orders in places where the wrong response meant death. The captain's BP was 65/38 now. Rachel pulled the ultrasound machine to the bedside. Her hands moved with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had done this in field tents with mortar fire echoing outside, with nothing but a field surgical pack and the certainty that if she didn't move fast, the man in front of her would die. The ultrasound probe found the pocket of fluid in seconds, a black lake on the gray screen, blood compressing the ventricles like a siege. Textbook cardiac tamponade. Textbook death in about 90 seconds if she didn't drain it. Prep the chest. Second intercostal space. Midclavicular line. She was already swabbing the skin with betadine, the smell of iodine sharp and copper clean in the recycled ICU air. Patient's anatomy clear on ultrasound. Fluid pocket is massive. Patterson held the supplies with white-knuckled hands. Should we wait for? No. One word. The kind that ended conversations. He dies waiting. What's his name? Sir, or his name. You know his name. Patterson swallowed. Captain. Captain Morrison. Rachel's jaw tightened for one fraction of a second. She didn't know she'd done it. But she pushed through. Hold here. Pressure. Don't move. The needle went in like she'd rehearsed it 10,000 times, because she had, in another life, in another body, in the kind of medical training that only happened when doctors wore uniforms and the classroom was a war zone. The 14-gauge angiocath needle found the fluid with a small resistance, like punching through paper, and then the hiss. The release. Air escaping, pressure dropping, and the captain's chest suddenly able to expand again. Syringe. She pulled back. The plunger moved, and the syringe filled with dark blood. 50 cc. 100. The monitors shifted. Blood pressure 68. 71, 74. 02 sat climbing like a bird returning to air. 78, 82. 85, stable. Patterson was breathing like he'd been the one drowning. Rachel pulled another 50 cc. Another. 200 cc total, a small ocean of blood that had been crushing the heart. She never took her eyes off the monitors. Never paused. Never questioned herself. Just worked the way combat medics work: information, decision, action, no hesitation, no doubt. Order a chest X-ray. Post-evacuation. I want confirmation the fluid's cleared. Page cardiothoracic. Tell them the tamponade is drained, but I want imaging before we close this line. Yes. Yes, I'll. And get me a bandage. Small dressing. Sterile. Patterson moved like the ICU itself had reorganized around her orbit. The captain's vitals continued climbing. BP 78 over 42. 02 sat 92 and holding. The heart was beating again on its own rhythm, not gasping, not struggling, just beating. The way it was supposed to. The monitors settled into their mechanical rhythm, beeping out the song of a man who was going to live. Rachel taped the small dressing over the needle site with movements that looked gentle but were just efficient. She didn't celebrate. Didn't breathe a sigh. Just finished the task and straightened, her hand still steady as a surgical laser, while Patterson stared at her like she'd just pulled a man back from the edge of the actual cliff. The silence in that room was the kind you could operate in. "He's stable," she said quietly. "Fluids are running. Monitor him for reaccumulation. If pressure climbs again, we repeat." "How did you, where did you learn?" The door lock clicked open behind her. Footsteps. Fast. Too fast. Dr. Sterling pushed through the doorway, already reading the monitor, his face shifting from irritation to confusion to something colder. He looked at the captain. At the drainage site. At Rachel standing in the center of the room with the captain's blood still dark on her gloves. At Patterson, whose entire nervous system had written the truth across his face. Sterling's face went white. Then red. Then something worse, the color of a man watching his world recalculate itself in real time. He said nothing to her. Just turned and walked out, his phone already at his ear before the door closed behind him. Rachel moved to the sink. She pulled off her gloves with precision, watching the blood spiral away under warm water. The water ran dark, then pink, then clear. Her hands emerged clean. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their fluorescent hum, indifferent to everything that had just happened. She heard Sterling's voice carrying through the closed door, muffled but clear enough. "Robert, it's Andrew Sterling. I need the board chairman." She dried her hands. She didn't shake. Didn't tremble. Just pulled another pair of gloves from the box and turned back to check the captain's line. "Yes, now. We have a liability situation. The agency nurse, Rachel Torres. I need you to understand exactly what happened here." Patterson was still staring at her like she was something his medical degree had never accounted for. Like she'd broken fundamental laws of physics just by being steady when the world was collapsing. Rachel met his eyes. Said nothing. Moved back to the bedside and checked the fluid levels, the pressure gauges, the flow rate. Everything was stable. Everything was correct. She had done this before, and her body had remembered everything her brain had been ordered to forget. Sterling's voice carried through the wall. "Second call coming." She could hear him dialing. "This is Dr. Sterling from Sacred Heart. I'm calling about one of your agency nurses. Rachel Torres." "Yes, the temp contract. I need her employment records verified immediately. I believe we have credential fabrication." "No, I'm serious. This person performed a procedure that was way beyond scope, and I need proof of who she actually is." Rachel didn't look away from the monitors. The captain's heart was holding steady at 88 beats per minute. Normal sinus rhythm. Perfect perfusion. The blood pressure was 82/48 and climbing toward normal. In another hour, maybe two, he'd wake up and breathe on his own, and he'd live. He'd survive. He'd go home to his daughter and his son, the Marine Corpsman, and his life, all because she'd refused to let him die. Patterson moved to her shoulder. Quietly said, "That was impossible." Rachel finished checking the foresight. "No. It was necessary. I've never seen anyone move like that. Hands like." "I'm going on break," she said. "The captain's stable. Call me immediately if anything changes." She didn't wait for an answer. Just walked out of the room, past the nurse's station where everyone was avoiding her eyes, past the water fountain where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry insects, and into the supply room where nobody ever went at 0200 hours. She sat down on an empty chair in the darkness, her breathing still even, her heart still steady, and she listened to Dr. Sterling's third phone call coming through the ICU phone system. "I need a private investigator who specializes in employment fraud. Money's no object. I have someone here who is not who she claims to be, and I need proof." By 0900 hours, security had arrived. By noon, Rachel was walking out of Sacred Heart Medical Center while Sterling read her termination papers from HR letterhead, his voice loud enough for everyone on the day shift to hear: misrepresentation of credentials, practicing beyond scope, unauthorized procedures. The temp agency called her cell at 14:30. The voice was apologetic but final. "Dr. Sterling contacted your references with allegations of fraud. We're terminating your contract and blacklisting you across our 4-state network effective immediately." Rachel didn't argue. Didn't defend. Just listened and hung up and drove to Arlington Cemetery as the sun fell toward the horizon like a burning ship. Section 60. The stone was simple and white. The name was carved in letters that rain hadn't weathered yet. She pressed her forehead against it and whispered into the granite silence, "I saved him. I did the thing. And it still wasn't enough. I'm sorry. I tried to stay invisible like they ordered. I tried so hard. But I couldn't let another one die." The unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, faded now, the embroidered anchors barely visible. Proof that she had existed once. Proof that she was someone other than the ghost the Pentagon had ordered her to become. She was still that ghost. Dr. Sterling arrived at 17 minutes past 0200. The captain's monitor showed sinus rhythm. Strong. Steady. Alive. Rachel stood at the sink with blood dark under her fingernails, hands angled beneath running water, the soap hissing pink down the drain. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. She could feel the silence behind her like a physical pressure, the way air changes when a predator enters the room. Sterling's breathing had gone shallow. Rapid. The breathing of a man watching his authority dissolve in real time. His face drained to ash, then flushed crimson as the comprehension hit him. This temp nurse, this nobody he'd been dismantling for 3 weeks, had directly defied his DNR order and saved the patient he'd already written off. The patient he'd told the daughter was gone. The patient he'd been using as a teaching moment about the limits of aggressive intervention. That patient. Alive. Because Rachel Torres had locked a door and moved like someone who'd held death in her hands before. Sterling's jaw clenched. His right hand reached for his phone with the precision of a surgeon, but faster, the reflexive grab of a man whose entire institutional framework was collapsing. He stepped into the hallway. The first call went to Marcus Whitmore, his former roommate at Duke Medical School, now chairman of Sacred Heart's board of directors. The conversation lasted 90 seconds. Sterling's voice never rose above a clinical tone, but his hand was trembling. "We have a credentialing issue. An immediate threat to institutional liability. Temp agency misrepresentation. I'm concerned about her other placements." The second call went to Patricia Chen at MedStaff Recruitment, the woman who'd referred Rachel because she owed Sterling 3 years of orthopedic referrals and preferred to keep the debt uncollected. "Patricia, I need to report a credential fabrication. This Rachel Torres you sent me, no legitimate nursing background. I need her blacklisted. Today. The third call was to a private investigator named Graves whose specialty was employment fraud and who'd done 3 previous contracts for Sterling at his personal request. Find everything. Background, military records if she has them, credential source, everything. And fast, this is time sensitive. Graves didn't ask questions. Sterling paid cash. By 0800, the hospital's HR director had flagged Rachel's file. By noon, Sterling had called her directly into his office with 2 security guards and a termination letter on his desk like a weapon. The words came out clinical and rehearsed, as if he'd practiced them while making his phone calls. Your credentials have been misrepresented on hospital files. You've practiced beyond your licensed scope of practice. Emergency pericardiocentesis is beyond a temp nurse's certification level. This constitutes a direct threat to patient safety and hospital accreditation. He read from the letterhead as if the paper itself had weight and authority. Rachel didn't argue. She didn't defend. She just listened while Sterling's eyes burned with the fervor of a man trying to burn away his own humiliation by incineration of evidence. You're terminated effective immediately. Security will escort you from the building. The rain outside was cold. Insistent. It hammered against the emergency room windows like Morse code from somewhere beyond the world, urgent and incomprehensible. Rachel walked between the 2 guards with her badge already off her scrubs, her jacket still damp from the night shift. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She knew exactly how far his reach extended. By evening, Patricia Chen had made calls. Sterling had made personal calls to 3 separate references Rachel had listed, all carefully constructed identities, all now contaminated with allegations of credential fraud. The blacklist spread like contagion across MedStaff Recruitment's network. For states. 17 hospitals. Rachel's temp profile flagged with a note that read credential fabrication, do not place. She was unemployable before the sun finished setting. Darkness came early that November. The rain came harder. Arlington's Section 60 was quiet in the way that only military cemeteries know how to be quiet, a silence that carries weight, that earns the right to exist. Rachel found the headstone by memory, not sight. Her forehead pressed against the cold granite like a prayer that had forgotten how to pray. The name carved there was not the one she was using now. The date said he was 27 when he died. The insignia said SEAL, Naval Special Warfare Command. She whispered to the stone, her words barely audible beneath the rain. I saved him. The captain. You remember. The one you said would make it out because he was good people, even if the army sent him instead of us. Her voice broke once, then steadied. It still wasn't enough. They're going to say I fabricated everything. They're already doing it. And I can't fight back because I'm not supposed to exist, and I broke the orders you died believing I would keep. I broke them because I couldn't let another one die just because I promised some 2-star I'd disappear. The rain soaked through her jacket, through the thin cloth of her scrubs beneath. I'm sorry. I tried. I really tried to stay invisible like they ordered. But I couldn't let him die on a unit with a doctor playing God, and now I've compromised the whole thing, and I don't know how to fix it. Inside her jacket, sewn with precise military stitches into the lining above her ribs, was the unit patch. Faded. Worn. The only physical proof of who she had been, who she was, who she'd been ordered to stop being. No military database held her image. No personnel file carried her name. Her service record had been burned in a secure facility after an operation in Sangin went so catastrophically wrong that 14 officials had agreed through channels above channels that she had never been there, never existed, never drew breath in that valley where 38 people died and 43 walked out alive because she held a position and refused to break. The discharge papers came with a new social security number, a new name, and verbal orders that would never appear in writing. You will disappear. You will work civilian jobs. You will not speak of your service. If you do, your benefits revoke, your pension disappears, and every government office will have instruction to deny you ever served. Understood? She understood. But the captain had flatlined at 0200, and her hands remembered things her mind had promised to forget, and some orders supersede other orders. Rachel stayed in the rain for another moment, her forehead still against the stone, and then she walked. Not toward the parking lot. Just away. Into Arlington's darkness, where the rows of white headstones stood like an army that would never age, never question, never forget. Her jacket, weighted with the evidence of everything she'd been forced to erase, pulled her shoulders down with invisible gravity. The patch underneath felt like a heartbeat. Like proof. Like something that couldn't be burned because she was still breathing. She had kept her promise. She had stayed invisible. Right up until the moment that keeping that promise meant letting the good die for no reason. And then she'd broken everything. If you're settling in for a good story, you're in the right place. Hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments what time of day it is where you are. Let's get back to it.